Okay, we're going.
Thanks.
We're rolling.
Are you ready?
No.
I have to take the microphone too. So,
Yes, yes, please.
what?
That's right.
It is for. It is not.
I'll do it.
So, let me see. Ah, okay, good. So I will chair this session to give Peter some rest, so the possibility to express his own thoughts and questions. So we have the chance that, or the luck, we are lucky that Nicola is ready to present us this quite important concept of teleportation in physics today. But he needs 5 minutes to prepare himself. So, what subjects we have to discuss? You wish that we discuss now? Suggestions, please. Andrew.
I would like to make these 3 specific suggestions.
Yes.
One is to pick up on the question that we asked, or I asked, just before the coffee break this morning, which in shorthand was, how do you avoid it just being turtles all the way down?
Okay.
And then the second and third one are 2 aspects of freedom which I think are very important, which we've scarcely touched on so far. One is freedom in the context of a community. Much of what we talked about is me as an individual exercising my freedom. But a lot of it, especially things like freedom to develop character and so on, are a community effort where we contribute to each other. And to some extent, the same is true of the third one. It's the component of freedom, and certainly the component of responsibility, that involves being able to anticipate the likely consequences of your actions. And what role does that play in freedom? And of course, that can be an individual thing, but it's often refined in the context of community. So I offer you those 3 topics.
Thank you. Other suggestions in order that we could topic we would like still to discuss before it is not obligatory that we spend all the time for discussing if there are no solved, but I think many questions, yes.
I think we can focus on some possible research agenda also, because there are some researchers in the room, and I think it's very important also to analyze on a philosophical point of view the new vision. I said before that perhaps there's more work for philosophers sometimes than for scientists, but also, as I try to stress in the end of my talk, there's many possible research ideas. I think in the room we have many people who are doing research and can have also ideas, because to push this new vision we must have always, of course, we must build this on result to convince the other people around us, outside, the outside world. We must have results. So things like your before experiment, I'm not saying this because you are in front of me, I'm saying this in other meeting, is a very important point, for example, because it shows its reality is really outside space and time, not only outside space as before, but outside time. So if we can think about experiment like this, and I have proposed some of them, but I'm sure other people have some idea about experiment. That's my point here. Breakthrough experiment.
Other suggestions? Well, I will probably, this whole issue of the neuroeconomics, this is me also important for future work, no? Because I would say there is happening also something like in neuroscience. They is initiating there a movement which can go in I would say, in a materialistic direction or reductionist direction, or could be integrated in a more larger vision, like we are discussing here. I think. Andrew, please, can I give you the word so to discuss the questions you propose?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
So, I mean, I'd be interested to know what order people would like to take these on. Let me give them to you in the backwards order to the one that I did before Nicolas taught. So one is when we're talking about freedom, how important a component is well, particularly when you're talking about responsibility, actually, the component of being able to anticipate the consequences of the choice that you make. And the second one was when we're talking about freedom, the expansion of the discussion from the individual's freedom to choose actions for which you will be responsible to the community aspect of it, both in a given situation and in Robert's, what do you call them, self-forming actions. So you can think of the whole sort of parental upbringing, the role of school teachers and education. It's a community, the role of preachers. It's a community activity where freedom is expressed, but freedom in a community, in a society, that adds an extra dimension to the individual's freedom. And then the third point was a rather separate one, which was the question I raised just before coffee. And I think even now, actually, we've helped to elucidate that this two-step process is a sort of conceptual two-step process rather than necessarily a sort of chronologically sequential two-step process. But nevertheless, insofar as the second step is about choosing between options that occur to you or become available to you, how does that help the question of what we mean by freedom to make choices for which we're then responsible in a way that goes beyond just pressing the question one level further down about what we mean by freedom. So those are the three questions I wanted to raise.
Okay, I'll start with the one about anticipation of consequences and moral responsibility. So most philosophers who work on free will connect it closely to moral responsibility. So they're interested in something that will undergird or ground or whatever support moral responsibility. Now, the lower your threshold or bar for free will, the more work you have to do then to get from there to moral responsibility. So if you think particles have free will or behave freely, then you have a long way to go before you get to moral responsibility. If you think fruit flies have free will or act freely, then again, you have a long way to go to get to moral responsibility. And so philosophers tend to set the bar for free will higher so that they're closer to moral responsibility. And that's because partly they think of free will in terms of moral responsibility. Now about anticipating consequences. So one way to bring it in is like this. Do particles anticipate consequences of their behavior? No. Do fruit flies? No. And do neonates, newborn babies? No. And we don't hold neonates morally responsible for what they do. And most of us don't think they act freely yet, although they're going to grow into it. And it looks like one thing you need in order to get to moral responsibility is the ability to anticipate consequences of options for action, and then to select among those options partly in light of what you think the consequences will be. So I hope that helps, but so I have seen in some of the stuff we heard very low thresholds for free will. And I'm an open-minded guy, so I think, oh, that's nice, but now how are we going to get from there all the way to moral responsibility? And so much work would need to be done to get there. Oh, maybe that's enough for now. I can talk about turtles all the way down. On the two-stage model, you have turtles and rabbits all the way down.
Yes, just a little comment there on this anticipation. For me, the main problem is that not always this anticipation, now I am not talking about moral consequence or of every action needs to be accompanied by this anticipation. Otherwise, it's not performed. However, most of the time we are not aware that this process is taking place. So this is something that is then very hard to study unless you have direct measurements of neural activity with invasive recordings and so on, where you can evaluate the presence of back referral signals that correlate with the anticipation and where you modulate, for example, the reward that the animal is expecting. And then you can see that the signals are modulated actually because what the animal expects. These experiments are very hard, in my opinion, to carry out, but probably.
Leonardo, then
I have to say two things. One, I think probably is more on the problem of freedom in the community. Maybe we can speak later about this. About anticipation, I think that neurally it is already possible to find structures that are involved in anticipation. I mean, there are many works that show that in prefrontal cortex there are neurons that are able to predict the consequences of actions. And so that this means that they activate much earlier than things can happen. Mm-hmm. So it is enough that I mean you can manipulate experiments in many ways, but since prefrontal cortex is very sensitive to the various information given by the context, they can choose which could be the action that could be done in particular situations. Wait if, I mean, it can keep also this in memory for a short time, so it can wait, but then also to begin some type of action based on what is the specificity of the context. So I think from this point of view there is already some
We can't ask the model how much he is expecting on every trial. This is the part I see more difficult. So it's difficult to what he is expecting.
What is expected?
Yes, if we want to measure, for example, disappointment or things like this that are related to a reward prediction error, for example, we need to ask, how much do you expect, and compare this with how much do you receive?
Why not?
Because the monkey is not going to tell me I'm expecting five francs. I guess so. I mean.
Well, no, because you see modulations.
No, but CNC modulation that it's very hard to quantify on a single trial basis this mismatch and the expectation of the animal. I mean, it must be done in humans. We are trying to do that in humans, of course. That can give you the answer.
In this sense, okay, yes, I agree. The second was more on the but maybe there are other discussion about this.
this point. This,
Well, I was going to say something which links both personal or individual freedom and the aspect of the community.
but this was already what we wish to address.
So if you wanted to.
Yeah, I wanted I was thinking about what again neuroscience can say about this, because of course speaking about communities, the role of neurons can be very important.
Very important.
So what we know about this, I mean, I think that until now we know much more about the communality between us and the others, because if you see the response of the mirror neurons and you don't know what elicited it, it could be both another individual or yourself. So you don't know from this discharge. At least maybe in the future we could, comparing the vision and the motor discharge, maybe we will find some differences. Until now we didn't have this idea. However, we know that we can, of course, recognize if I'm acting or another individual is acting. And for example, because I have proprioceptive information while I'm acting, while I have visual information when another individual is acting. But we don't know if, for example, mirror neurons are informed about this. So it could be also that other structures are involved in giving this information. And there is another piece of evidence that I think is very interesting. In the lab of Iriki in Japan, they did an experiment of social interaction, in which there are, let's imagine, two monkeys that are sitting either one in front of the other or one on the side of the other. So when they are one in front of the other, there is no real interaction because every monkey can have his own food. But when they are aside, of course, one can dominate on the other. And one is dominant, the other is the non-dominant monkey. And if they recorded from one of the monkey, the non-dominant one, and they found that there were neurons such as mirror neurons responding during observation of, during the action of the other monkey. But it's interesting that if they changed the place, so if the monkey that was dominant was not able to act with the right hand, that is the preferred one, but with the left hand, so the discharge is lower. So that it means that the social interaction also can modulate the activity of this type of neurons. And I think pursuing this type of experiment would be very important. And the third thing that I wanted to, now I forgot the third point.
You think about
yes, the interaction. Because yesterday I didn't have the time to present just a few data. For example, we found that there are mirror neurons that respond much better when the action is done by another individual far from the observer than in his peripersonal space, I mean the reaching space. Other neurons behave the opposite. So it means that there is also something to do with the distance between observer and agent, and probably this has to do with the interaction. So that, for example, if let's imagine for humans, if an action is made by another individual in my reaching space, this can be used for interacting. So that I recognize the action, but I use this understanding for interacting, and often also for anticipating what the other is doing. But we need much more data on this. So which is we know more on the understanding side. So what is the next? How we use this understanding to interact with other people?
Thank you. Leonardo.
I can put a short
Sure,
example.
please.
For example, what we do every day. When I'm talking to people, I know where to look. I place my eyes on very specific positions of a face, for example, the eyes or the mouth. I don't do it randomly. However, I am not thinking in doing that. I know where to look, I look and I do it. However, if you don't do it correctly, then you have probably a case of autism. So it's completely involuntary, it's completely unconscious. Not doing the right thing have enormous consequence because, for example, autists, they can't understand emotions in faces. And we know that they don't look at the right places. As simple as that. So, and this is one example of these social interaction procedures we automatically follow.
It's like the difference between the introvert and the extrovert mathematician. The extrovert mathematician looks at the other person's shoes.
This links on very nicely because in part it goes to this question of free will and responsibility and indetermination. But the thing that we haven't discussed so far, again another great Aristotelian category, is habituation. And of course it's the process of habituation which enables us to learn and enables us to do things unconsciously. When it comes to making moral decisions, of course this is a particular type of habituation which is known as the acquisition of virtues or vices. Now, what do we mean by habits? We mean, it seems to me, well, there's an act is actually doing something. A capacity is the raw capability of doing something. A habit is the tendency to do something in certain circumstances. So it's known as first act, or as opposed to second act, the completion of the act. And we couldn't survive without, and I think modern neuroscience has shown this, we couldn't survive without a huge number of habits, languages, a form of habit, habituation, etc. Now, of course, when we've made these, I suppose these self-forming actions, in a sense, assimilate in some ways to those actions which have been crucial in forming virtues, it seems to me. And so consequently, although your range of possibilities may be in some way constrained by the way that you have acted in the past, it's not that you're not responsible for them. So there's a distinction there between responsibility and determination. However, what I find particularly interesting is the sense in which, and this is where it brings in the mirror mechanisms, is social habituation. So if you think of the way that you sort of learn things from other people, or that you're embedded within different sorts of practices within institutions, they can also limit or expand the number of possibilities open to you, but you're not necessarily responsible for them in the same way. In fact, you may be a victim rather than an agent in those instances. And there's a lot of very interesting work now in the social sciences. I mean, it's long been a discussion in the social sciences, how you relate structure and agency. And one very interesting solution to this problem has been proposed by somebody called Margaret Archer. And she has a model which I think is very harmonious with an Aristotelian perspective. But I think this idea of freedom, going to the question of how the social dimension is important, is a crucial one. And I think that we have a number of concepts which can be utilised in that way.
Yeah, this question for Leo. I want to know, where is the limit? Because I heard that if you look at a robot who is taking the apple, for example, your motor neuron will not fire. But if you look at
They do.
For a robot? I think it was not. Ah, really? So.
But,
in the same way.
I mean, to be precise, they respond to an action made with a tool that is not a hand, of course. And in humans, you have an activation of a mirror neuron system during observation of both the hand and the robotic hand.
Okay,
So probably
I
because
have an idea that there was a living, non-living separation in the system.
I mean, as far as the non-living object acquires the meaning of the biological effector.
Okay.
If I could follow up on something Leo is saying with Andrew's lovely joke about the dominant mathematician, because in social interactions, and this is Sarah's point about the autistic, who cannot control the eyes are an extremely important indicator of our relationship with every other person. And I noticed while Leo was talking, I turned my head quickly, and you looked at me to see if something was important was happening. So we know the dominant mathematician actually applies to all persons insofar as there is one who is tending to dominate. When they walk into a situation, they don't look the other person in the eye often. they look away, and animals too, because they're looking at the situation they're in. And so there are these studies that Michael Platt brought to Harvard a few months ago, in which he studies gaze following among the monkeys. And the gaze following is extremely important, because if there's an alpha male, all the other macaques don't look him in the eye. They
have to look down.
They are looking around. However, they're using their peripheral vision to see what the alpha male is looking at. And if the alpha male looks over here, all the other ones look to see what's important being studied. And this is an intense kind of exchange of information, which is not mirror neurons at all, but it's similar in the sense that we are working with one another to try to understand.
And they demonstrate also the level of neurons. So there are mirror neurons.
They are.
The mirror neurons
Yeah.
are still firing also, so
Okay.
just wanted to make that point, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Further questions? No. Well, then,
I'm trying.
yeah, please.
I mean, Andrew was suggest there's a slide that I didn't have a chance to show, which is sort of more general. And Andrew suggested I might want to show it later. And so at the end, but it's outside of the current scope of discussion.
Sure. Come.
I mean, it's a joke.
So,
No, no, I
We'll have to wait and see.
you have.
It's Lewis's takeaway messages from our
Sure,
meeting, and
sure.
I think they're quite
Again, I mean, this
useful.
is from the point of view of an outsider, somebody who
okay.
we've never been to a meeting like this.
Yeah.
It's probably already.
You have.
Oh, what is
What
going
is this? I don't know what this is.
She is coming.
It's in the same presentation as I before. I wrote that this morning, so it does not completely reflect everything, but almost everything that we've done. Yeah, the script is very nice. Just leave it as this. So, this is a list of things that I think reflect this morning's discussion, and that I thought, at least from my own perspective, of someone who's not a philosopher, a physicist, or a neuroscientist, that I thought was interesting. I mean, the first one is one that I already kind of knew about, and I think it's kind of useful. It applies certainly to economics. It's the idea that I said, it's perfectly fine to have particular sciences that have models that you know from the start that are incomplete. I think that certainly is the case with economics. And there's a matter of, how useful they are and what are the confines. Maybe they're just this, maybe there's something bigger. And I think that applies to economics clearly, but also to neuroscience, physics, and I think to a lot of other sciences. Second thing, it's related to that. To be honest, I don't think a lot about free will. I mean, it's not something that I think about. And for most people's, even scientific work, it's actually not very important. And the paradox is that for your own personal life, it's absolutely crucial. So I'm not sure what the solution of this is, but I think it's a paradox. Because even from a point of view of physics, most of what you do, it really doesn't matter how to interpret whether, there's quantum randomness, quantum indeterminacy, or free will. I think for most practical and scientific purposes, they're observationally equivalent, and therefore not important from the point of view of the science in particular, I think. Of course, this doesn't apply to philosophers. And of course, this doesn't apply to philosophy as well, but I think one thing that it's very interesting, I mean, in grad school, I had a lot of physicists and computer scientists that I worked with, and I always found they're a little bit arrogant because, if you talk about a theory of everything, there's an element, pardon me for saying that, there's an element of arrogance in it. And I finally found, it's here's a body of leading edge scientists who agree that there's no scope for physics alone to come out with a theory of everything, which I think is a very interesting observation. And finally, the idea that metaphysics is hot. There used to be a time where people kind of joked about metaphysics, but maybe there's something in it. There's a renewal, opportunity for renewal, not in the traditional kind of setting of categories and framework, but certainly some form of renewal of ideas from metaphysics, in particular in this context of quantum mechanics. Anyway, just
Thank you.
suggest.
So, someone wishes to react to this provocation or to these provoking statements? Moment.
Yeah.
Who?
Why don't we?
So, who?
Craig.
Craig.
Yeah,
Okay.
can I just ask Nicola one clarification of my question earlier? So the quantum states and elementary particles, are they correlative in a sense? So I'll try to explain this. The structure that is transported is the same.
Teleported, not
Sorry. Teleported. The structure that is teleported, that's the same structure as that which went along with the original elementary particle. But when I mean same structure, right, I mean so there's sort of this structure that went in this thing, right? So how much of the thing itself is doing determining of the structure? Is it doing any determining at all?
But I guess most physicists, all physicists would answer, yes, it's the same, because there is nothing that allows us to distinguish them.
Yeah. And that would be consistent with.
So, I had a thought, this is a wonderful thing you presented, Nicholas, but I had a thought that you're transporting the structure of that photon. Teleporting, sorry. You're teleporting.
I can transport myself from here to there easily.
Right. Well, here's the point. You're teleporting the structure of the photon, but not the photon itself, right? Now, if it is science fiction if it were human beings, but I think it's an interesting question. If it were a human being, and you teleported the structure, what would that be?
But if it is really teleporting, so at least it's the entire body. Let's suppose I teleport that glass of water. It's maybe simpler because it has no soul. And so that glass of water, there's just sand and some water. I mean, the same molecules as here, or at least the same atoms as here, but they are just without any structure. It's just let's say, sand. And at the end of this teleportation process there, you have the same glass of water at exactly the same temperature, with exactly the same dust on it, with each molecule of water here being exactly the same location, the same orientation. So all the microscopic structure of everything here would go from here to there, and here I would now have my sand.
You have your what?
The sand, just the unstructured material, so it is just
where
dust.
this is
Sand or the atoms that made sand?
If I teleport everything, it would just be the atoms.
No, this is where the
So then Nick, that has Nick first, and Andrew, and we have more.
Maybe just follow up on this, Nicola. So how would you distinguish between the situation you described and a structure, well, two structures, one simultaneously popping out of existence and into existence, right? How would you distinguish between the same structure being teleported and one structure popping out of existence and another popping into existence simultaneously?
Right, it's the same. But it depends now, again, it's the structure only, yeah. It's not the entire object, but it's exactly the structure here pops out of existence, but still the matter is still there.
Yeah.
And there you have the dust, the matter, but without any structure. And
It's not without any structure. This is the important thing. There are
no,
a
it
number.
has no structure. It's important that it has no structure. So, there's no classical analog of having no structure. But it's half of an entangled pair of glass.
In the classical sense, and this is what the question of
Let me
translation.
try to first answer. By no structure, I mean whatever experiment you do, you always get a random answer.
Right,
Totally
that's
random.
fine. It would still. There's a minimal structure in terms of in classical terms. So what you have is sort of, because you still have some matter there, you still have some stuff there. So the point is that they're not. It's not what you've transposed. It's not that there's just one. It's not just that there's just one form. You see, forms can exist at different levels.
Yeah, that's true.
Andrew, list.
Antoine and I and others are wanting to get to the Gaudi Church.
We didn't
so
finish the previous one.
I'll accelerate what's an interesting story. Derek Parfit in the 1980s drew an analogy with the fax machine. Now, Nicola quite rightly made the distinction, and I'll come back to that at the end of this very short account. Derek was doing this thought experiment in the context of asking the question, who am I, and what is the continuity of me as a person?
That's what I was getting at.
And he said, it's a bore getting in the plane from Barcelona to New York. And we now know that with information, we don't have to put the letter in an envelope and send it over on a ship or in an aeroplane. We can send it by fax. We can get the information there. What happens if we do the same to me as a person? I step into the machine here. It makes an exact copy of me at the other end. Once the copy has been verified, I'm required to press the destruct button at this end. Is it then me at the other end?
That's right.
And then the point of his experiment is, but what happens if I break the rules and don't press the destruct button at this end? Now the distinction is that in the teleportation you don't have that choice. You cannot choose whether or not you're going to destroy the information at this end. In fact, it's even a bit more scary because the information gets destroyed before you check that the teleportation has been successful at the other
Yeah.
end.
Well, I asked the question for precisely this person because there has been a long debate in philosophy about personal identity.
Yeah.
And some of it has taken these forms about moving it. Now, for example, the form of a person, the glass is already much more complicated than your photon, but the form of a person is going to include everything in the brain, all the memories, all the thoughts, all the character traits, everything. So the question is, are you reincarnated? That's the question. And there had been a continuing debate about this in philosophy for now the past 20, 30 years. Parfit has been involved in it rather deeply. But it is an interesting question. Is it you? Which means that if the form can be transferred into different matter, to use the Aristotelian language, that is what we call reincarnation. Or is reincarnation, actually it's called resurrection in the Western tradition. Resurrection of the body, as they say.
But it could be translocation.
The big issue here we relate to black holes too, and this would be twofold for another meeting. But Nicola, wish you to put less word about this teleportation.
No, the last word of the conference. But maybe just on this point, I mean, if it would not be the same person, that would be a proof that a person is not only made out of matter.
Yeah, well, that's it. People have different views about whether it would be the same person or a different person.
Well, to finish, to conclude, another interesting question I have put to Gilbrasar this morning, because he was one of the discoverers of teleportation, is whether he would be also possible, or he has some idea how to produce bilocation and not only teleportation. He says that for the moment I think it is not possible. So then we conclude here. Well, I am quite happy about this experience in these days, especially how the different experts and disciplines have communicated with each other. I think it was for me, I think, quite a confirmation that this meeting is useful and necessary. I thank you, all of you, for your work. I would like to stress that please control your biosketch in the home page, the abstract, and send your presentation presented here as soon as possible to STI. So these three things are important to put immediately in the home page. So biosketch, abstract, presentation. And the paper,
2 weeks, 3 weeks, maximum?
maximum for these three things, I would say 1 week.
1 week.
1 week for these three
As
things.
soon as possible,
So
doesn't
controlling the view sketch is already in the homepage. Please control it. Check it. Excuse me. Check it. Abstract. Most of you have already sent, but check it too. And the presentation, send it
when you come back home, next day send the presentation. And then for the paper, we would be glad we could have all the papers reviewed and completed and corrected till the end of the year, if possible. If someone has urgent reason, can write to me.
We didn't hear, Antoine. By when?
End of the year.
End of the year, I would say. Well, then I would, I give you the word. I would especially also thank Peter for chairing all the sessions. And once again, I thanks very much Carlos for helping us to run this meeting. I thank Tracy, Krista, Fiona and Craig for all the help. And I would stimulate you to find in your neighborhood other Carlos Caballers that are ready to promote these meetings around the world. I think it's quite very useful and for all of us. Thank you very much.
I started this meeting a few days ago, thanking everyone in advance for all of your work, and I didn't know the half of it. You really all surpassed yourselves. You've floored me. You've all witnessed a miracle. You've taught me physics in 2 days, and I think you didn't know you were going to see a miracle as well. And I've already thanked everyone by name, but as a group now, as community as well as the individual, as a community, really went just over the top. Also, everybody worked together really well, and there was a lot of great discussion. It was respectful. We kept to our schedule, which is another miracle. 2 miracles in one session. Thanks again, and anything we can do for you after this, also keep in touch with us to help you get anything forward or any.
Could we also thank Bob and Holly?
Oh, yeah. My pleasure. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you.
And Peter for the amazing moderation.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you.
Ya, sí, que está bien. A ver si conseguís la publicación.
Esta es muy importante.